In the early hours of September 23, 2015, Mark van Dongen lay asleep in his bed, unaware that his life was about to change irrevocably. Berlina Wallace, his former partner, stood over him. Moments later, she would throw sulfuric acid over his face and body, laughing as she said, "If I can't have you, no one can." The attack left Mark with catastrophic injuries, paralysis from the neck down, loss of sight in one eye, and the amputation of his lower left leg. After 15 months of unrelenting pain and suffering, Mark chose to end his life through euthanasia in Belgium. Mark van Dongen, a Dutch engineer, met Berlina Wallace, a fashion student nearly 20 years his senior, in 2010. Their relationship began with promise but soon turned tumultuous. Friends and family noticed the volatility. Mark's father, Kees van Dongen, described his son as gentle and kind, often too good for this world. By August 2015, Mark had ended the relationship and begun seeing another woman, Violet Farquharson. Wallace, unable to accept the breakup, became increasingly erratic. She purchased sulfuric acid online and researched its effects, including viewing post-mortem images. On September 22, 2015, Mark returned to Wallace's flat, concerned for her well-being. He decided to stay the night. At 3 a.m., Wallace threw the acid over Mark as he slept, causing immediate and excruciating pain. Mark endured multiple surgeries, including the amputation of his leg. He was left paralyzed and in constant pain. Despite his condition, Mark regained the ability to speak with assistance. However, the psychological toll was immense. In January 2017, Mark applied for euthanasia in Belgium, citing unbearable physical and psychological suffering. On January 2, 2017, Mark's life ended, accompanied by his father, who honored his son's wish to be present. Berlina Wallace was charged with murder and throwing a corrosive substance with intent. She denied intending to harm Mark, claiming she thought she was throwing water. In May 2018, Wallace was acquitted of murder, but found guilty of throwing a corrosive substance with intent. She was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 12 years. Kees van Dongen expressed that the sentence was too lenient, stating that the family had been sentenced to life. Mark's life, filled with promise and kindness, was tragically cut short by an act of pure evil. His story serves as a somber reminder of the devastating impact of domestic violence. When Mark van Dongen chose to die through euthanasia, he didn't just end his own pain. He ignited a legal, ethical, and emotional firestorm that would haunt 3 nations: England, Belgium, and the Netherlands. This wasn't just a crime. It was a modern tragedy that, when a man dies from injuries 15 months after an attack, is it murder? That was the question facing British prosecutors after Mark van Dongen's death. Berlina Wallace was charged with murder, but her legal team argued that Mark's decision to end his life broke the chain of causation. They claimed she threw the acid, but he chose to die. The defense painted her as mentally unwell, even suicidal, claiming she never intended to hurt Mark, just herself. But evidence told another story. Wallace had done her research. She knew exactly what sulfuric acid would do. She'd purchased it weeks before the attack, under her real name. She even Googled images of acid attack victims, mangled faces, melted skin. Mark never stood a chance. Before his death, Mark gave a police statement. Paralyzed, blind in one eye, leg amputated, skin grafts. He whispered. She laughed as she threw it. She said, "If I can't have you, no one will." Mark's voice, recorded from a hospital bed, became the center of the prosecution's case. But it wasn't enough. In May 2018, Berlina Wallace was found not guilty of murder. Instead, she was convicted of applying a corrosive fluid with intent to do grievous bodily harm. Her sentence? Life imprisonment, but with the possibility of parole after 12 years. To the public, and to Mark's grieving father, it felt like a slap in the face. He said, "She has been sentenced to life, but so have we." Kees van Dongen had been at Mark's bedside every day after the attack. He watched his son suffer, watched him give up, and held his hand as he died. He would later admit that euthanasia was the only kindness Mark had left in this world. Mark's case wasn't isolated. In the 2010s, the UK saw a horrifying rise in acid attacks, many involving jealous lovers or gang violence. His death sparked renewed calls to classify acid as a weapon and to restrict its sale. But critics asked, why did it take a young man's death to act? Today, Mark's memory lives on not just in news archives, but in reforms, awareness campaigns, and acid attack survivor support networks. She said if she couldn't have me, no one would. Now, no one will ever have me again. Mark van Dongen didn't choose to die. He was robbed, first of his body, then of justice. His story is a warning that when obsession turns to cruelty, and cruelty goes unpunished, we all lose something. And we must decide how many more before we say, never again? It's easy to think the story ends when a gavel falls, when a sentence is passed, when a victim is buried. But some crimes echo louder after justice is served. And for those left behind, the horror continues long after the headlines fade. In this final chapter, we revisit the damage you can't see, the psychological warfare before the acid, the trauma etched into every survivor and loved one, and the disturbing truths still buried about Berlina Wallace. We often talk about the body, burns, scars, surgeries. But what about the mind? Mark van Dongen didn't just suffer physically. For years, he had been emotionally manipulated, gaslit, isolated, unmade. Berlina Wallace had a pattern. She isolated Mark from friends, accused him of infidelity, monitored his messages. One former friend recalled, he wasn't himself around her. He'd always glance over his shoulder before speaking. A post-trial analysis confirmed Wallace showed signs of borderline personality disorder. But critics say that label, while real, was weaponized in her defense, not as context but as excuse. Dear Berlina, I wish I could make you understand that I never stopped caring, even after we ended. But your anger has no bottom. I'm afraid of you. I can't live like this. Undated letter, found after the attack. Mark wrote that letter in private, just weeks before the attack. He never sent it. Maybe he feared her reaction, or maybe he already knew what she was capable of. It wasn't jealousy, it was ownership. If she couldn't have him, he belonged to no one, not even himself. She was the woman Mark had moved on with. They'd only been together a short time, but in that time, he'd smiled again. Wallace found out, and days later, Mark was screaming in agony. He told me she was unstable. I told him to be careful, but he said he'd handled worse before. Anonymous witness, court transcript. She vanished from public life, her name buried to protect her from the trauma and scrutiny. But the guilt, many say, still haunts her, because, in her words, he died trying to love again. Sulfuric acid doesn't just burn skin, it devours it layer by layer. Mark lost his left eye. His upper body tissue sloughed off. His tongue melted. Even after dozens of surgeries, he was unrecognizable. The doctors said his suffering was unendurable. And when euthanasia was approved in Belgium, it was a mercy. It was the final medical procedure, because nothing else could help. Wallace's legal team argued that she didn't kill him, that he chose to die. And yet, Mark had lived 15 months trying to stay alive, until he just couldn't anymore. The judge ruled that despite the horror, the prosecution hadn't proven murder beyond reasonable doubt. Instead, she was convicted of grievous bodily harm, 12 years minimum, eligible for parole by 2030. She never apologized, never wept, never admitted guilt. The only tears in the courtroom belonged to Mark's father. Keyes still speaks of Mark in the present tense. He visits the cemetery every week, reads old messages, listens to voicemails, and sometimes he dreams that Mark walks through the door. He once said, "They say time heals, but they didn't lose a son like mine." Mark's death spurred legislative change. The Offensive Weapons Act 2019 restricted the sale of corrosive substances. Minors could no longer purchase them, and carrying acid without a reasonable excuse became a criminal offense. Still, critics say enforcement is slow. Acid attacks continue, silent, devastating, permanent. And Mark's story becomes a warning. Buried in law books and whispered in support groups. There are still questions no one can answer. Why did Wallace's previous behavior go unreported? Were there other warning signs? Was this preventable? Or was Mark simply unlucky to love the wrong person too long? How many more Mark van Dongens will it take? Mark didn't die the night the acid hit him. He died the moment society failed to protect him. When silence covered red flags. When laws weren't strong enough. When empathy came too late. Sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones you've already let in. Mark van Dongen's story is over, but yours isn't. If you or someone you know is in a coercive or abusive relationship, speak before the silence becomes a scream, before the scream becomes a scar, before the scar becomes a eulogy. She's still alive, still breathing. Behind concrete walls, Berlina Wallace serves her sentence in relative silence. No remorse, no known apologies, no parole yet. But in 2030, that could change. Berlina Wallace remains incarcerated, serving a life sentence with a minimum term of 12 years for the acid attack on Mark van Dongen. Since her sentencing in 2018, Wallace has maintained a low profile within the prison system. There have been no public statements, interviews, or expressions of remorse. Her silence leaves many questions unanswered. Kees van Dongen, Mark's father, continues to grapple with the loss of his son. He has spoken publicly about the profound impact of the tragedy, describing himself as a broken man. Despite the passage of time, the pain remains raw. Kees's life has been irrevocably altered, and the memory of Mark's suffering continues to haunt him. The case of Mark van Dongen prompted significant legal discussions in the UK. In response to the rise in acid attacks, the Offensive Weapons Act 2019 was enacted, introducing stricter controls on the sale and possession of corrosive substances. While these legislative changes aim to prevent future tragedies, critics argue that more comprehensive measures are needed to address the root causes of such violence. The psychological impact of acid attacks extends beyond physical injuries. Survivors often endure long-term mental health challenges, including PTSD, depression, and anxiety. Organizations like the Acid Survivors Trust International provide crucial support, but the journey to healing is arduous and deeply personal. Despite the trial and sentencing, many questions remain. What factors contributed to Wallace's actions? Could the tragedy have been prevented? These questions linger, serving as a somber reminder of the complexities surrounding domestic abuse and mental health. Mark's story has left an indelible mark on society. His case has raised awareness about the devastating consequences of acid attacks and the importance of addressing domestic violence through advocacy and education. His legacy continues to inspire change and promote healing. Mark van Dongen's life was tragically cut short, but his story serves as a powerful catalyst for change. As we reflect on his legacy, we are reminded of the importance of compassion, vigilance, and the collective responsibility to prevent such tragedies from occurring again.